मेरा हिंदी तो इतना अच्छा नहीं है, हर बंगाली का हिंदी बहुत ही बुरा होता है, क्योंकि बंगाली में लिंग नहीं होता है, तो ये कुछ फेमिनिन कुछ मैस्कुलिन ऑब्जेक्ट्स, किताब फेमिनिन, पुस्तक मैस्कुलिन, we get very confused with that. So please don't mind if I speak in English, and I will try to be brief. I don't wish to talk really very much on current politics. सुनाई दे रहा है तो पीछे? I would like to just go back to what was Marx's original intellectual project, and was it completed? That is one question. And the second question is, what was incomplete, and how is it important for us to complete it? A little bit of biography. Many millions of words are being written on the occasion of the 150th anniversary of the publication of the first volume of Capital in 1867, and the approaching bicentenary of Marx's birth on 5th May 1818, which is past now. The historic contribution made by, in quotes, the greatest living thinker, these are the words of Engels, opened up an entire intellectual continent. Intellectual continent is paraphrasing Louis Althusser, the philosopher, and inspired a new era of revolutionary praxis. Marx spent the first 31 years of his life, up to 1849, in various European cities, engaged in developing his critique of idealist philosophy and writing for short-lived socialist journals. Hounded by censorship and by state persecution, he moved along with Engels to London in the summer of 1849 and lived there for the rest of his life, passing away in 1883, a few weeks before his 65th birthday. So, during the period that Marx and Engels were working on their path-breaking analysis of class exploitation and accumulation as the core reality of capitalism, they lived in Britain, and they lived in London, the capital of Britain. Britain, the first country in the world to undergo capitalist industrialization, and the center of the largest colonial empire of the time, far larger than any of its other European nations. And of course, India was Britain's largest and most lucrative colony. And yet, the reality of the effect of the possession of colonies on metropolitan accumulation and on their industrial development was not addressed in his writings on political economy. Neither in a contribution to the critique of political economy published in 1859, nor in Capital Volume 1 published in 1867. As you know, the second and third volumes of Capital were edited by Engels from manuscripts and published long after the first volume. Volume 2 of Capital in 1885 after Marx's death, and Volume 3 in 1894. The rigorous formal model of capitalist accumulation that Marx developed in the 3 volumes of Capital deal entirely with a closed economy, and international trade does not figure in it, nor does colonialism. Of course, there are descriptive passages on slavery, on primitive accumulation, there are many references to colonial loot and plunder, but it is this fact that the formal model of capitalism did not integrate trade and colonialism. This is what has given rise to the almost complete ignoring of colonialism and imperialism in the present day northern tradition of Marxist writings. And we are influenced by those writings, because none of the speakers before me have made a single reference to imperialism. Whereas, as far as I am concerned, imperialism is not a thing of the past. Neo-imperialism is alive and well and kicking today. And we are, in our country, being subject to neo-imperialist domination. So don't forget that just as being a good Catholic does not mean that you count your beads. Being a good Marxist means developing Marxism further in the light of current developments, and not actually saying that we simply stick to what Marx himself said. But two facts make it clear that Marx was very well aware of colonial exploitation, and even towards the end of his life, of the drain of wealth from India. Firstly, in the articles that he contributed to the New York Daily Tribune, Marx frequently referred to Britain's exploitation of India, and he also referred clearly to the drain of wealth in a letter written a mere 2 years before his death. I want to talk a little bit about this. His extremely insightful writings on India in his contributions to the New York Daily Tribune have been available in a publication, very old publication from Progress Publishers in Moscow called On Colonialism. Everyone should read that. And there is a recent collection which has been put together under the title Marx on India. It's edited by Iqbal Hussain with an introduction by Irfan Habib. Second, if we study Marx's intellectual project as he himself summarized it in his preface to the 1859 book, A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, it becomes very clear that Marx never meant his analysis to remain confined to a closed economy. He fully intended to study the global working of capitalism. He says the following in his preface. He's laying out his work project, what he intends to do. And this is in 1859. I examine the system of bourgeois economy in the following order: capital, landed property, wage labor; the state, foreign trade, world market. These last three phrases are important: the state, foreign trade, world market. I'm continuing with the quote: the economic conditions of existence of the three great classes into which modern bourgeois society is divided are analyzed under the first three headings, that is, landed property, wage labor, capital, landed property and wage labor. The interconnection of the other three headings is self-evident: the state, foreign trade and world market. But the second part of his intellectual project on the state, foreign trade and world market was never even started, let alone completed. And how much more can you expect of a person, of a single person, who was hounded all his life, who suffered economic privation, who lost, I think, 4 of his 7 children at a very early age because of these privations? He completed only the first part of his own intellectual project. This is very important to remember. Now, Marx's seminal contribution as regards the understanding the meaning of exploitation under capitalism was to show that although the worker under capitalism appeared to get the full reward for his labor in the form of a market wage for a day worked, this wage embodied only the necessary labor required to reproduce his life for a day, and this required only part of the working day, the remaining part being surplus labor, for which he was not paid. This part of his labor, the surplus labor, was taken as surplus value by the capitalist. The market transaction of wage payment for labor, which appeared to be an exchange of equivalence, there seemed to be no unfairness in it. I am providing labor, I am getting a wage for it. So what is the origin of surplus? That is what he was concerned with, and he laid bare that mechanism, the reality of the appropriation of surplus labor by the capitalist in the form of surplus value. But there was another form of exploitation which was extremely important for capitalist accumulation from the beginning in today's advanced countries, which was not addressed, and which has still not been addressed to this day in a proper manner. And that is the exploitation of the subjugated peasants and workers in the colonies. Okay, they were caste divided, but the point is they were all exploited equally, whether they were Dalits or non-Dalits. Remember that. The crucial point here was the colonizing power obtained the right of extracting economic surplus. In India, it was Britain's right of collecting taxes, with the taxes on land being the most important. The peasant either paid tax directly or paid rent to the landlord, who in turn paid tax to the colonial state. Now, a large part of these taxes making up the budgetary revenues was set aside as expenditure abroad. Now, this does not happen in any independent country, that a part of your revenues are not spent within the country. And it was a very large part. It was about 1/3 in the beginning, went up to almost 40% by the time we come to the 1920s. What was this part used for? It was used for purchasing export goods produced by the peasants and laborers, but it was the very same peasants and laborers who had paid the taxes in the first place. Okay? How? In the form of land revenue in the case of peasants, in the form of indirect taxes on commodities, necessities like salt in the case of laborers. So what is happening is that they are paying money as taxes, and a part of their money is then being used to purchase their product. So they are not actually being paid at all. Okay? 200 साल से उन्होंने हमें उल्लू बनाया, और अभी भी उल्लू बना रहे हैं, because you do not find a recognition of the fact that the peasantry and labor of our country were not paid for the export goods which were taken from them. Why they were not paid, is it clear? It's very simple once we understand it. Because if I take your money and then I say, I like your pen, and I give you 50 rupees of your money and buy your pen from you, that is not a normal market transaction. I'm not actually buying your pen. I'm simply taking your pen as part of tax. So the entire international purchasing power of India's export surplus was kept by Britain. None of it came back to this country. And this has not been analyzed properly to this day. What was actually the drain of wealth? How did it impoverish our peasants and laborers? Why did we end up with a famine in Bengal? Why did we end up with the lowest per capita food grain consumption in the entire world? And why do we still have the lowest per capita food grain consumption to this day in the entire world? Lower than sub-Saharan Africa, lower than even the least developed countries. And that has to do with imperialism. The imperialists wanted access to our land, which was far more productive than theirs. And once they got political control, they used taxes to buy export goods. So all the gold and foreign exchange which was earned remained in London to pay for their deficits on global trade. And the peasants and workers were not actually paid, because their own taxes they came out of the budget as so-called payment. So this was a very important aspect of international exploitation, which is as important as the exploitation of the wage laborer by the capitalist. And we have to understand how it operated. I have written a book, not a book, I intend to write a book, but I have a long paper recently on the drain of wealth, and I calculate that over the period 1765 to 1938, the drain of wealth from India, which impoverished our population, totaled 1.84 trillion pounds on a very underestimated basis. And this comes to more than 10 times the current value gross national product of Britain in 2015. So if our government and our economists even understood what had happened, they would ask for reparations. But they don't understand. In fact, they don't understand even what is happening today. Now, however, before I go to the current situation, which I will in a couple of minutes, I want to say a couple of words about the fact that right towards the fag end of his life, I mentioned that in his own writings, right up to practically the end, Marx actually does not talk about the drain of wealth. He talks about loot and plunder. He talks about deindustrialization a lot in India, but not the drain of wealth. So it is very intriguing and interesting that we suddenly find that in February 19, 1881, only 2 years before he died, He was already 63 years of age. He's writing a letter to Danielson, and he gives a very precise and detailed description of the drain from India to Britain, which he has not said before in any of his previous writings. I'll give you the quote from Marx, this letter. In India, serious complications, if not a general outbreak, is in store for the British government. What the English take from them annually in the form of rent, dividends for railways useless to the Hindus, pensions for military and civil servicemen, for Afghanistan and other wars, what they take from them without any equivalent, and quite apart from what they appropriate to themselves annually within India, speaking only of the value of the commodities the Indians have gratuitously means freely, without payment, and annually to send over to England, it amounts to more than the total sum of the incomes of 60 millions of agricultural and industrial laborers of India. Very precise. More than the incomes of 60 million of agricultural and industrial workers is being taken without equivalent by the British from India. He has never mentioned it in such precise terms before. In fact, if we did not know who was writing this, it sounds like Dadabhai Naoroji. But this is Dadabhai Naoroji's language. You know, the drain from India, measured by the export surplus, without any equivalent. Naoroji and Ramesh Chandra Dutt call it unrequited export surplus. They simply took without payment. Now, the interesting thing is that it is well within the bounds of probability that Marx actually met Dadabhai Naoroji, because Naoroji had been resident in London for many years. You may know that he was also a member of Parliament to the British Parliament, and he had business interests which he undertook in London. And he was very friendly for many years with Henry Hyndman, who was closely associated with Naoroji from the 1870s onwards, and Naoroji helped Hyndman with information for a book that Hyndman wrote on famines in India. Now, Hyndman had become a socialist very late in life after reading Marx's Capital around 1880 only. And he is known to have invited Marx and his daughter to his house in early 1881. So it is quite possible that either Marx met through Hyndman, Naoroji directly, or Hyndman himself, who was very familiar with Naoroji's arguments, put these arguments to Marx, because before 1883, we do not find Marx giving such a clear explication of the drain from India. Now, let me come now to matters which are of immediate relevance. How many minutes do I have? 5? 5? Wait, I'll extend my own limit to about 7 minutes. Alright? Because, you know, there's a lot to say, but it's impossible after all to put everything together, and you won't be able to absorb it either if I just throw facts and ideas at you and listen. So I'll confine myself to something very immediate. You see, there is an idea that many people have, including on the left, that the primitive accumulation of capital that we see today going on. And by the way, I think one of the most useful ideas we can get from Marx's writings is the idea of primitive accumulation of capital. If you see the book I have edited on the agrarian question in Marx and his successors in 2 volumes, I've given the quotations from Capital on primitive accumulation. What did Marx mean by primitive accumulation? He meant that the grabbing of resources by capitalists. Now, many people think that this is something which happened only at the beginning of the process of capitalist production. But it is very clear from what Marx says that no, primitive accumulation is a process which goes on through the entire life of capitalism. Not only right in the beginning when the capitalist system is getting established, but even after it is well established, even after it is dominant, capitalists are still grabbing resources. Who are they grabbing resources from? Well, historically, they engaged in the greatest land grab in history when they seized the whole of North America and Central America, South Africa, Australia. They massacred the indigenous people. It was not, these lands were not empty lands. They had indigenous inhabitants and civilizations, particularly Central and South America. They massacred the original inhabitants, they drove the rest into reservations, and I would call it the greatest land grab in history. And then the problems they had with labor displacement in their own country, they overcame by exporting their labor through the physical out-migration of their population to the lands they had seized. So I've made some calculation of the rate of out-migration. You know, for 40 years after 1815, 40% of the total out-migration to North America was from one country alone, from Britain. And why were people migrating? They were permanently leaving their land because they were getting displaced by machinery and there were no jobs. This is very important to understand because many of our intellectuals, including on the left, including those who have run left-run governments, have a completely wrong idea that capitalist industrialization displaces people from the land, yes, but that is necessary for the formation of a proletariat. And the displaced people will always get absorbed within a growing industrial sector. Not at all. Even in the first industrializing nation, the rate of rise of labor productivity was so great, there was no question of absorption into the growing industrial sector. One machine, simple machine, the spinning jenny. You know, one man would spin, or woman more likely than a man, one thread of yarn using a spindle. A spinning jenny with 80 spindles displaced 78 spinners. Just one small machine. And you knew, 800 spindle jennies were known by the 1790s in England. So labor displacement even in the first industrial revolution was massive, and there's no way they were absorbed domestically. There was tremendous social discontent and upheavals, but the pioneering industrializers got rid of their social problem simply by exporting their unemployed through out-migration and in other ways I don't have time to go into now. Do we have that option open to us today? Those who say that, well, doesn't matter if peasants are getting displaced, doesn't matter if this primitive accumulation is going on. And in what form is primitive accumulation going on in front of our eyes? You know as well as I do. There are actually two methods. One is the encroachment of the corporate sector helped by the government, which subscribes to wrong ideas about industrialization and employment. They are displacing farmers and laborers in the name of industrialization, which will never actually absorb the displaced persons, through the setting up of special economic zones, through the grabbing of land for so-called productive purposes, but in many cases they're not productive purposes at all, as you know. They're also used for real estate speculation and so on. This is going on in front of our eyes. Our peasantry and labor are getting displaced through a process of primitive accumulation. The other method through which they are getting displaced is through the agrarian crisis, which has been unleashed by neoliberal economic policies, which has been going on for the last 25 years. And I regret to say that many progressive people who are beneficiaries of this process, we are all beneficiaries, every one of us sitting in this room, because the range of modern technology which has become available to us would not have been available to us otherwise. So we close our eyes to what it is doing to 70 to 80% of our population, which is getting displaced through the operation of neoliberal policies. And what are these policies? These policies are replicating the crucial structural features of colonial rule. One feature is extreme compression of spending by the government. Before 1990, the government followed an expansionary fiscal policy. It was spending freely on rural development, We might have our political differences with the governments of that time, but there is no doubt that all this came